Welcome to the Washington Week Extra. I'm Yami Sendor. As we reflect on September 11th, 20 years later, many questions still remain about how this attack changed American life, politics, and policy. Joining us tonight to talk about these questions, Peter Baker, Chief White House Correspondent for The New York Times, Pierre Thomas, Chief Justice Correspondent for ABC News, and joining us here in studio, Asma Khalid, White House Correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast, Martha Raddatz, Chief Global Affairs Correspondent for ABC News and co-anchor of This Week, and Vivian Salama, a national security reporter for The Wall Street Journal. Thank you so much, all of you, for being here. Vivian, I want to start with you. I spent the last few days really kind of, in some ways, digging into all of the different things that happened on 9/11 as someone who wasn't a reporter at the time. You, of course, experienced them. I've been thinking about what this world looks like now when you think of Osama bin Laden and his influence over these extremist groups, multiple groups that now exist that are in some ways wedded and connected to the idea of al-Qaeda. You have also Americans who are fearful in the U.S. and still stuck in Iraq and with troops there. What do you make as you reflect about the state of the world, given what you've reported on?
You know, a big chunk of my career has gone to trying to understand the root causes of why anyone would perpetrate a huge attack like on September 11th. I did my graduate studies on it even. And so many of the things that I studied, so many of the root causes that I studied with regard to Islamic groups in Afghanistan, across the Middle East, are very similar to some of the domestic issues that you see now when it comes to disenfranchisement, frustration with government, socioeconomic issues, those kinds of things. They are so similar. And, you know, there are going to be people that are going to throw religion into the mix as a distinguishing factor, but I promise you it's not one of the central issues, and I've spent a lot of time on this. And so it's really interesting to see sort of how we've come to understand and appreciate our role as Americans who invaded a country like Afghanistan and the responsibilities we had to that population. We're talking about it a lot, obviously, these days because of the withdrawal. Same with Iraq, same with a number of other countries. And then talking about also our responsibility as a government to people here at home. How well have they been served? Are they getting what they need? Are they frustrated with the government? Are some of those issues behind what we saw earlier this year on January 6th? So many similarities I see over and over again, and it's something that we will continue to be talking about in the years to come.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And Peter, when I was thinking about the idea of what the legacy of 9/11 is, and one of the other things that came up as we covered these wars was this idea that the U.S. used tactics that were not condoned under the Geneva Convention. I wonder if you can talk a bit about how that impacted America's standing and also how it informs the way we go forward in the modern war on terror.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Look, in every war in our history, we have pushed the boundaries of what we used to consider to be appropriate and decent, right? We suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. We jailed people for sedition during World War I. We put Japanese in internment camps in World War II. So similarly, this time around, in this 20-year period, we went beyond what people had once considered to be acceptable with torture techniques, with the Guantanamo, prison, with Abu Ghraib and the abuses there, all of which may have had some short-term benefit. That's certainly an argument that some people have made. A lot of people say that's not the case, but certainly had long-term damage. Whatever possible, we gained out of those moments of excesses, they created a different image of America around the world. Rather than be the country that stood up for values, they heard Americans say, well, if the terrorists do it, why can't we, in effect? And I think that really had a long-term impact to this day. You hear, even today, if you travel around the world, you hear people say that America is, in fact, the exceptional country that America likes to believe it is, that we don't stand out in the world as a model the way we once did. And I think that that's a long-term legacy issue that we will grapple with for years to come.
Martha, I want to come to you about and have you reflect a bit about the decisions that the U.S. made after 9/11 when it comes to the wars that you covered and how it impacted our role in the world in the ways that Peter was just talking about.
In those early days at the State Department, and I was also covering the Pentagon, the early days of the State Department, the world came together like you have never seen. I mean, you could feel it. And I was traveling with Secretary of State Powell at the time. Everyone was behind us. It was an amazing feeling. But then when Iraq happened, that went away, and it went away quickly. When I look at the decisions that were made over the years, and we've all reflected on it after the withdrawal, and I was in Afghanistan at the end of June when the U.S. forces were pulling out and before they had to go back in and evacuate. I think of how many times I've been there and how many senior officers and generals that I heard over the years say, it's going well, we can do it. I think you send the military in there and civilians make those decisions. You send the military in there and they're going to say, yes, 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 we can. I recently interviewed the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mike Mullen, and he said something that I thought was pretty profound. He said, looking back himself, he said, I think sometimes we have to say, no, we can't. We can't do that. I mean, look at the training of the Afghan forces. It's absurd. And I remember at the very beginning, having people say to me, look, the illiteracy rate, they can't drive, they can't read, they can't shoot. And that does not make an army. And then also to just believe that once the United States left, that they would still be somehow loyal to that. Is also absurd. I mean, they are going to go with whoever's in charge and save their own lives.
And thinking about the lessons, Pierre, there was the other thing that happened with the law enforcement domestically in this country, and that was that there was this sort of, if you talk to critics, this militarization of the police. If you talk to supporters, it's this sort of beefing up of our terrorism prevention techniques. Talk a bit about the legacy of that. I was in Ferguson when there were tanks rolling through. Rolling through St. Louis, and I remember looking up as a reporter thinking, a tank? Like, where'd that come from?
Well, part of the issue was that the FBI, Homeland Security, forged a much more close working relationship with local police departments. And there was suddenly all this federal funding available to police departments to get equipment. Again, the fear factor that we talked about before. Well, what if the terrorists, the bad guys show up and there's a big shootout at a mall? We need to have all these capabilities. And, there was a real belief in that. Obviously, critics have said that police turned around, got all that equipment, and then were quick to use it against people who were lobbying for civil rights, and therefore you hear the word militarization. So on the one hand, the legacies of 9/11, it's just layers upon layers of it. If you just think about, for example, the difference at airports, where you used to be able to drive up to an airport, get a ticket, and fly. Now you can only bring liquids on, of a certain amount, and you're taking off your shoes and you're taking off your belts, and there's a very close look at electronics. So I can't think of too many other events in recent American history where it literally transformed overnight how we viewed the safety of this country. Our own Charlie Gibson was talking about that on Good Morning America today, the notion that we thought we were protected by two oceans, and suddenly that evaporated in the course of one day.
Vivian, there's also this issue when you think about things that changed immediately. I was reading about sort of the way that people saw and trusted the government, the media after 9/11, that shifted, maybe not immediately, but definitely shifted. What are your thoughts and what do your sources say about just this age of misinformation, disinformation that we're living through, and how that connects to white supremacy and domestic terrorism? You have Merrick Garland saying that the top domestic violence extremist threat in this country is groups that are advocating for the superiority of the white race. Make sense of all of that and what your sources tell you.
Well, we're in the process of trying to make sense of all of it, I think. But largely, you're seeing with technology coming and advancing so much over the past 2 decades, a lot of people try to manipulate that in the way that information has always been, groups have always tried to manipulate information in time. With regard to what we're seeing in the country, with regard to domestic terrorism, white supremacy issues, we are coming off a period of time where there's been a lot of cyber attacks, a lot of leadership misinformation, including the former president, who is known to misguide a lot of people with his own words and rhetoric. foreign adversaries who are hacking into our system and trying to take advantage of the political disarray and the social disarray in our country right now. And so it's layer upon layer of factors and not just one issue that is creating it. But we do see none of this is new. Certainly not. White supremacy is not new. Domestic terrorism is not new. And a lot of these other issues that we're talking about. But with technology sort of putting it out in the forefront, it just seems now like people are so much more aware of it. It has bubbled up into the surface. It's also kind of made its way into the political discourse as well, with the former president, taking to the podium at his rallies and saying things that are seen once upon a time as completely politically incorrect and absurd and sometimes just shocking to everyone. And suddenly we were talking about them at political rallies and at the White House. And so, so many factors that now have us talking about it and so aware of it, which is the first step toward addressing these problems, obviously, but we're all very keenly aware of it now.
And in the same regard of thinking about the idea of awareness, Martha, I was thinking about and reading about the number of people that are left in Congress that were actually serving during 9/11. I saw a study that said 16% of Congress was there. So I wonder what you make of the fact that the leaders that are here now that are making these decisions, they're not the people who were the ones, at least a lot of them were not the people who were the part of the group that unified, and there was this kind of short-lived but really intense bipartisanship moment.
Yeah, very short-lived.
Very short-lived.
Very short-lived bipartisan moment. I think, you point out that now I couldn't give you the figure off the top of my head how many veterans are in there right now. And even so, look at the divide between the veterans. I mean, if that tells you anything, who many of them have had the same experiences, but that divide is vast. I mean, they may have that in common, and they may have that history in common. They may not have been there at 9/11, but they have that history, and still there is this complete divide. And I don't really know how you get it back. I mean, I have no answer to that. I see not a whole lot of progress lately. I mean, things have certainly changed in some senses with Joe Biden, and the discourse is different, but you still have that just massive divide. And when you look at where our country was after 9/11 and how the world looked at us and where our country is now, and what happened on January 6th, as Vivian pointed out, it is disturbing, to say the least, and you just have to wonder how you can possibly get any form of unity back.
How you get any form of unity back is in some ways the thesis of how President Biden willed himself to this presidency, right? Asma, like, we're covering a president who ran on this idea that I can get the country back to this place of unity. But what's complicating the path there? And at that same notion, we also have this country, as President Biden is trying to bridge the political divide, we have a country that's still very, very dangerous of Muslims and brown people when they're just walking down the street.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Martha. Like, I'm not particularly optimistic about how you do this. President Biden just earlier today released a video commemorating 9/11 and spoke at length about his desire for unity throughout the campaign trail he did. And we even had Democrats who would kind of scoff at this idea, thinking that he was an old school politician who didn't understand the times. Look, I think, Yamiche, to some degree, I would argue that as much as this president wants unity and wants bipartisanship, he and his team is beginning to understand that that may not be as plausible as they once hoped. And, I know that we're talking about 9/11, but a completely different subject is what we saw from him yesterday with COVID vaccine mandates. For many, many months, he was trying to cajole people to get vaccinated. And it seems like for him, the era of persuasion on that matter is over. And now he's moving to the era of forced mandates. Mm-hmm. And there is a recognition that perhaps the unity he desired is just not plausible with an entire segment of the population.
Peter, just weigh in here, because I think, you've covered so many presidents. You know what the challenges are for President Biden. How does he get there when there's all of this division?
Yeah, I'm struck, Yamiche, by one big change in 20 years. 20 years ago on 9/11, 3,000 people in the United States died, and we all agreed that something needed to be done about it. And we all, in fact, agreed more or less to give up a little bit of our liberty in order to do it. As Pierre talked about, we might not have liked it, but we gave up, a little bit of our liberty at the airport. We gave up a little bit of our liberty in the sense of surveillance cameras everywhere, in terms of more universal requirements to show IDs and so forth. We believed that was necessary in order to prevent 3,000 people from ever dying again the way they did on 9/11. Yesterday, the president told us that we had to, most businesses are going to have to require vaccines. And we had 3,000 people dying from COVID every 2 days. We have a new 9/11 every 2 days. By the time your next show airs, Yamiche, next week, we'll have had the equivalent of 3.5 9/11s. And yet there is this sense that masks and vaccinations are an impingement on our liberty on the part of at least some Americans who don't want to come together, who believe that this is in fact something to rebel against, something to protest against. And so that sense of unity, that sense of solidarity, that sense of coming together for something larger than ourselves, to make a sacrifice, however big or small, for the country or the community at large, that's what's different today. And it's really remarkable, given the scale of what we're seeing today with COVID, that it hasn't come close to matching the kind of sense and spirit that we had, even for a short amount of time back following 9/11.
And Pierre, when we think we're talking about a 9/11 almost every day, you think about COVID, but I want to in some ways go back to this idea of just security threats at home. Talk a bit about what you're hearing when it comes to the threats that are facing us after January 6th. There's a rally on September 18th that's planned. We're seeing fences, or there's plans for fences to go back up around the Capitol. What are you hearing from your sources?
Well, it's a complicated situation. Namely, they will tell you with great confidence, and we'll see if it bears out, that they think we're in a much better position to prevent the kind of scale of attack that we saw on 9/11. That the notion that many people could plan something that big, partially inside the United States, they just believe that they have the sourcing, they have the technology and the informants to block something like that. On the other hand, they are very unnerved at the moment that you have a rise in domestic terrorism fueled largely by race-based hate, and at the same time, ISIS and Al-Qaeda remnants using social media to extort people, exhort people, I should say, to attack. And the fascinating thing is that apparently the white nationalists and the far-right radicals, who they're most concerned about right now, are using social media in the same way. So you have this moment where after the withdrawal of from Afghanistan, you have these disparate groups, all on social media, all on the dark web, saying, do something, do something. And what they're most concerned about, Yamiche, is the notion that you don't have to train in training camps. You don't have to go overseas. You don't even have to get funding. You just need to be able to be influenced through social media and online to convince the stable and the unstable, the angry and otherwise, to do something. And we had a case in point that a source pointed me to, where a man in Texas, who they had under some level of investigation for suspected terrorism ties several years ago, and who also was thought to have mental health issues, 2 Sundays ago called a Lyft driver. Female Lyft driver showed up. He murdered her in cold blood, took her car and drove it to the Plano, Texas Police Department, walked into the department, fired shots, and was killed by police. My source said that they found some note suggesting that the person was angry about Afghanistan, and the source said, imagine if this person had been able to shoot several people, a dozen people or more people in that police department, you would have had the very kind of thing that I just described. Scary,
scary stuff. Vivian, you were nodding your head. I'm going to give you the last word here. Are we still in the global war on terror in the way that it was outlined at the beginning of this 20 years ago? And what does the terror look like now?
Joe Biden would very much like it to be over, for sure, and we left Afghanistan last week with that intention. I think the administration is very keen to kind of turn a new chapter. Does the threat go away? It's evolved. I won't say it goes away, but it's definitely evolved. Our ability to track has probably improved just as technology has gotten also a bit more sophisticated. So the ability to also perpetrate is more sophisticated and has changed a lot. But as far as what it's done to us, to our psyche, everything like that, I mean, you know, you have Arabs and Muslims in America who gasp every single time something goes wrong because they're still afraid of sort of the backlash that might come as a result of any attack because they suffered so much. And so there's trauma that still lingers from it for sure. And I think that's something that the war on terrorism is kind of stays with us. That element of it doesn't go away very easily.
Well, we'll have to leave it there tonight. Thank you so much to Peter, Pierre, Asma, Martha, and Vivian for joining us and for sharing your reporting. Make sure to sign up for the Washington Week newsletter on our website. We'll give you a look at all things Washington. I'm Yamiche Alcindor. Good night.